Talking Tech Policy is recorded on Ngunnawal lands. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land and acknowledge their continuing connection to country and the ongoing contributions of their elders past, present and emerging. We extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, who were, among many things, the first Australian tech innovators. How do we make sure technology makes our lives better? Hi, I'm Johanna Weaver, host of the Talking Tech Policy podcast. I'm a lawyer, a diplomat, and until recently, I was Australia's expert to the United Nations on cyber issues. A few months back, I joined the Australian National University to establish the Tech Policy Design Centre. We're launching this podcast because we want to empower more people to get involved in tech policy. We're kicking off with a double episode. This is part 2. In part 1, I interviewed Minister Fletcher, the Australian Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. If you haven't yet listened to that episode, I urge you to do so. But for the moment, let me introduce you to our guests for part 2 of our launch box set. I have with me here today 3 very excellent guests, and I am really excited to introduce them to you all. We have Melinda Cilantro, who is an economist, but we're not going to judge her because she's an economist. She is currently the Chief Executive Officer at CEDA. You've had senior roles both in business and in government, which I think is actually quite an unusual position. And you have really stood out to me as one of the senior leaders in Australia who understands tech policy and is passionate about it. And I think there are lots of people in Australia passionate about technology, but the tech policy is particularly unique. So Melinda, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today.
Oh, thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Our next guest is Stilgherrian. Stilgherrian is a freelance journalist, a commentator who covers the politics of the internet and the way that is changing power relationships at every level of society. He is particularly interested in internet policy, cybersecurity, privacy and cybercrime, and in his own words, hoovering up bull dust. He is also a host, in my words, of an excellent podcast called the 9 p.m. Edict. And actually, I should have mentioned Melinda's podcast as well, which is an excellent podcast, The Economist's Corner. And for me, Stilgherrian, you've been writing about these issues for probably longer than you want us to say, but I have always appreciated your passion and enthusiasm for the subject. So thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure, even if that is just a polite way of saying I'm old.
Old but wise.
Oh.
And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Emily van den Nagel. Emily is a lecturer of social media at Monash University. She researches social media identities, cultures, pseudonyms, anonymity, intimacies, memory, and algorithms. And she is the co-author of a book, Sex and Social Media, which, Santa, if you are listening, is now on my Christmas list. So, Emily, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Johanna.
We have come a really long way in relation to technology in a very short period of time. And I always think it's interesting to hear from each of the people that I'm talking to about what your first interaction with a computer or with technology. So let's start first with Melinda. What was your first interaction? She's laughing. It's a good start.
Yeah. Oh, Johanna, you had to start with me. And I am going to carbon date myself here. I thought, what was my first interaction? And then I had to go all the way back to high school. And, I actually remember filling in one of those punch cards.
Oh, wow.
Right? Like, so see, I have carbon dated myself. Where
I've seen them in a museum once.
Yeah, no, I know. You get the pencil out and you fill them in, and we sent them off. I don't know where, and I think it was part of some lame high school project, and maybe we got a printout that had some picture on it or something afterwards. So that was my first one.
Were you impressed by it? Did that
No, that didn't impress me at all. My second one, which I think is kind of interesting to reflect on, my parents remind me of this all of the time, and I wasn't impressed at the time, but I am now when I think about it. They used to run a small business, and I think they were one of the first small businesses in Australia to have a Wang word processor.
Oh.
And I can't, the cost of that in today's dollars was enormous. But what they did was actually direct mail promotions to customers who, not realising that it was a Wang word processor, thought that the owner of this business had hand-typed and hand-signed
Oh, wow.
a promotional deal for them. And it was hilarious because what they used to do was set this thing up to run, press go, and then go home for the night and come in the next morning hoping that the printer with the little perforated paper with the things on the sides had fed through 1,000 letters overnight. And if it hadn't, then they just had to start all over again. So there you go. That's my ancient tech experience.
So your parents were possibly the first spammers in Australia?
Yes, indeed.
Still, Gary, and I can see you have something to say.
Look, I want to know whether Melinda's experience with the little optical mark cards was in South Australia.
Yes.
Ooh.
Then those cards went off, because I did it too, to a place called the Angle Park Computing Centre, which was indeed a lame high school thing. But a couple of forward-looking teachers in South Australia had got hold of somehow a second-hand IBM System 360 mainframe.
And how many of those would there have been in Australia at the time?
It would have been less than 10, certainly.
Yeah. Amazing.
I mean, those were computers that were built from the late 60s up until just past the mid-70s, I think. So the period we're talking about would be somewhere probably in the second half of the 1970s, perhaps in the middle. So, yeah, thumbs up from Melinda. So that was my first experience too, except I was one of the special boys who actually went out to the Angle Park Computing Centre itself and could type directly into the mainframe computer on a green screen terminal. Then the internet, for me, sort of pre-commercial internet in Australia. There were amateur-run bulletin board services such as FidoNet, which sort of connected to the internet. They dialed each other up in the middle of the night to exchange emails. So email was an overnight thing in those days. And then in the very early part of the 1990s, there were ways of getting a permanent internet connection via a cutout organisation through universities. It was all set up legit, but it meant you could have a not expensive permanent internet connection at all of 2,400 characters per second, dial-up speed. But it meant that several years before there was commercial internet in Australia, you could have a permanent internet connection in your home.
Wow. All right. So maybe, Emily, what was your first interaction? And I suspect you're going to be moving us forward slightly a little in the timescale, which I don't mean to be rude, but it's just a factual observation.
Getting roasted for being the young person. Yeah, exactly. The noob on the panel. Thanks very much. I certainly remember a time pre-computers and pre-internet. I have fond memories of the computer at home being connected to the internet for the first time and having to go through the screechy dial-up process to access things like email and chat rooms, which seemed very sparsely populated. I can remember when I got an email address, I think the only people I knew who also had an email address were my dad and my older sister, and I think a kid who lived a few streets away. And that was about it. So it was a bit difficult to see how this technology was going to transform every single social connection that I had. I actually feel like I grew up very much alongside the emergence of social media, actually, given that by the time I got to high school, there was a lot of connection and, oh goodness, a lot of social politics being conducted over MSN Messenger.
Oh, yes, MSN.
And then, just as I was leaving, MySpace was taking off and Facebook was something that ended up connecting me to a lot of my new friends at university. So, from that sort of time onwards, it wasn't just three people in my life who had an email address. It really felt like everybody I knew was being connected through these platforms, and they've been very important to my life and my work ever since.
Yeah, and it is incredible, right? Because the period of time we're talking about and kind of laughing about is only 40 years. And, that the transformation that's happened in that 40-year period from a technological point of view is enormous. And now we have all of our regulatory frameworks really sort of struggling and straining to keep up with all of that change. The other question that I really like to open with is why technology policy issues are important. And for me, it's a no-brainer. And I think one of the best things about working in this field is if it's something you're passionate about, it's an area where you can have real impact. But the flip side of that is that there are also a lot of numpties in this field who are passionate and who have real impact. And so we need more voices to be engaged in the conversation so that we have a diversity of voices, not just the voices of those who are interested. And so for people who are listening to this and maybe going, oh, is this something that I want to get involved in? Why is this an issue that is important for all Australians to be engaged in?
I mean, first of all, I just think policy is important. So let me just declare that. I am a complete policy nerd. And I have this great belief that all people should be interested in policy. So you can take that how you will. Tech policy, it's just, technology is just so important in our lives. And you've just talked about the funny summary of 40 years of, what's evolved. And you can see how much it's transformed our lives, how we communicate, how we work, the opportunities. It's just quite simply tremendous what's before us. And there's opportunity and there's risk. And my concern is that if we don't really start seriously talking about tech policy and how we show stewardship for technology, we're going to end up with a really suboptimal outcome because people are going to think that certain things are being looked after and they may not be. There's going to be a potential mismatch or misalignment of expectations in terms of the tech sector and government and the community. And my experience has been that when that happens, what you tend to get is, regulatory backlash in a way where you get regulatory overreach, which isn't good either. That's particularly compounded in this space, I believe, because I'm not super confident that we've got the level of knowledge and understanding across policymakers and politicians to get the nuance right in regulation. So that's kind of a quick sum of why I think it's so important.
Yeah. So I would love to come back to that point, Melinda, because the asymmetry of knowledge is something that I'm particularly focused on. And I think the stewardship point really speaks to me. And there's this sense, I think everyone's read the dystopian novels. There's also utopian novels. And I think at the moment, there's the risk that we're sort of sleepwalking towards dystopia because people are not paying attention. So Stilgarian, one of the things that I'm always attracted to in your writing is the fact that you do take these deeply technical issues, you have knowledge and understanding, but you also connect them to the societal issues. So what's your elevator pitch for why this is important?
Well, I tend to zoom way out and start with that old statement that knowledge is power. Information informs knowledge. Information's just data. So we are in the process of completely rewiring the way the planet handles information, which means effectively we're replumbing the way power works. And that does sound pretty grand, but I can see you all nodding when I say that. So the question then becomes, who is controlling who has access to what? Who decides what will be knowledge out there and what will be knowledge that we can't have? And, we say, well, we don't live in an authoritarian society. And well, yeah, these are all shades of grey. And history teaches us that it doesn't take long for a society to change into an authoritarian society. We could name countries around the world right now where they were quite surprised by political happenings in their own country in the last 4 years, to pick a completely random number. So it comes back to, to bring the policy angle is who is making those decisions, and are the people making those decisions actually knowledgeable about what they're doing, or are they just going with the flow? And of course, the large tech companies are very powerful. They're corporations worth hundreds of billions of dollars. They've got, if you like, a GDP up there with some of the mid-ranking countries on the planet. And Do we want them making the decisions? Do we want politicians who may or may not be well informed making the decisions? Or do we just want to cruise along? We're only at the very beginning of this journey in a way. I mean, only 40 years, but the idea of high bandwidth, always on, always with you in a mobile sense connections are more like about the 10-year mark, very early days.
Yeah, and I think I love that idea of replumbing power. I think that's a great description. And it really emphasizes what's at stake in these conversations. And at the moment, I think you have government and you have industry, and we're missing the independent middle voices. We're missing a vibrant civil society. There are some civil society organizations, but not enough. And really, that is something that was part of the motivation for me establishing the Tech Policy Design Centre, is to help build and mature that ecosystem so that we can have more people involved in the conversation. And you, listener, are our target audience. Emily, why do you think people should be more involved in this discussion?
Well, look, I think that the reason people should care about tech policy is because they use tech. This is something, if we think about what tech policy is, it's a series of decisions about how technology works in a particular context. So if you are part of Australia and you use technology, and that's a lot of people, then I really think that you have a stake already in how this policy works, who makes decisions about it, and how those decisions come into play. We're really attached to our devices and our streams of content and the way that we find out about the world through our screens, big and small. So the people who are trying to make the rules about that certainly deserve interrogation and attention.
Absolutely. And accountability, I think, is really important. One of the future episodes of the podcast that I'd really like to focus on is, where are all the hidden elements of technology in our lives? But for now, we're going to keep focusing on the conversation from Minister Fletcher. I interviewed Minister Fletcher 2 days after the anti-troll legislation was introduced. And you can't see me, but I'm using inverted commas when I say anti-troll legislation. And also the day after the big tech inquiry was announced. So, Emily, this is very much sits within your area of expertise. We've heard Minister Fletcher's description of what that anti-troll legislation is designed to target. Can you give us a high-level overview of what the intent of that legislation is? And then we'll delve a little bit more into some of the critiques. And I can hear Stilgarian holding himself back already.
I'll be good.
So what's really going on here is a new bill that's being discussed in terms of its power to address trolling. And I feel that the term trolling is used very deliberately here to simply encompass a whole lot of malicious online behaviour. I mean, it's interesting to me that we're even discussing abuse and harassment and defamation under the umbrella of trolling, because, I mean, in my research, I really understand trolling as much more of a playful behaviour, and one that's often satirical and fun, and I guess trying to really speak back to power in a way that's mischievous. I understand harassment and abuse as things that, sure, can overlap with trolling. Absolutely. Some trolling is very unkind, but harassment and abuse are not playful ways to poke fun at the powerful. They're crimes. So it's interesting that the bill is framed here as an anti-trolling mechanism that's legal. What it's really doing is responding to the defamation case by Dylan Voller, which was talked about with the minister, that found media outlets responsible for defamatory Facebook comments. And what it's trying to do is basically give individuals a clearer pathway to suing people for defamation, which doesn't really address a lot of the things that we understand as part of the trolling, I guess, family of practices. And what it really does is put the powerful in charge of who is getting sued for speaking out online, instead of, trying to address abuse and harassment as crimes and try to make try to make platforms and corporations more responsible for the kinds of speech that they have on their platforms.
All right, Emily, we'll drill down a little bit more on some of those issues. Stilgarian, if you were to sum this up in one sentence, what would you say that this legislation is about?
It's about protecting the feelings of powerful white men by wrapping it in a thing that makes it sound like it's protecting women and people of colour and other vulnerable folk.
All right. Thank you for that. That is a very, very nifty soundbite.
You said one sentence.
I know.
That's really it.
I'm impressed with your ability to deliver one sentence. I mean, one sentence so pithy, and not your ability to deliver one sentence.
If I can expand on that, though, I mean, it really is. People have suffered the abuse kind of trolling, which is, as Emily says, is really just abuse, harassment, etc., which is already a crime, but kind of blurring the boundaries with this idea of defamation, which the minister talks about. Well, we have defamation laws offline, we're just bringing them online. And yes, the ones offline disproportionately favour the rich and powerful. So they really, it's about, we kind of let it go that all these other people were harassed, but now my feelings are hurt and I need to know who it is. I want their name now so I can be in touch with them.
Yeah. So I think just to drill down on that point about why it's disproportionately used by the rich and powerful, it's because defamation, of course, is a cause of action that you have to go to court for. Court is expensive, long. You need fancy lawyers usually to take this type of action. So I think that is a very valid point. But I don't want to focus too much on the legal action of defamation. What I would like to do is also focus on the efficacy of this proposed legislation. So the way that the minister describes it is that this legislation is designed so that if you wanted to proceed with defamation actions, putting aside the merit of who can access that, if you wanted to, anonymity shouldn't be the bar, shouldn't prevent you from doing so. Now, Emily, that's quite a different point to removing or unmasking trolls, and that having the effect of reducing this type of behaviour. Now, I know that's something that you've focused on in your research. So could you just tell us a little bit about what your research has found with respect to the anonymity aspect of this legislation?
So in my research, I have talked about and written about a lot, I guess, the value of anonymity. And I'm really suspicious of any kind of moves made, especially by governments, but, also by social media platforms that seek to eradicate anonymity. And we see this solution come up again and again. Some bright spark suddenly gets the idea, hang on, if we just made everybody use their real names, everyone would be nice to each other on social media, which just astounds me that this is still a conversation that's happening, because we know that just doesn't work. There's so many instances of really vile abuse and harassment that happen under people's real name, and that actually there are huge and hugely important arguments to suggest that people who are anonymous are doing so for really valid, really important reasons. Twitter has done a study recently after there was racist abuse directed at black players on England's football team after they lost a match to Italy. Now, this unfortunately led to a huge upswing in people sending racist tweets to these players and in the mix. Of the accounts that Twitter permanently suspended for this abuse, 99% of them were identifiable. And that's, even though that's just one instance, it really goes to show, I think, how unafraid powerful people are of attacking others, not from behind some kind of cloak or a mask of anonymity, but from their position as a powerful person in society. This is also something that, for example, Yasmin Abdel-Majid has spoken about a whole lot.
Yeah, she's spoken very beautifully about it.
For her, the real trolls, if you wanted to go ahead and use that term, were often journalists who were publishing stuff about her that was really upsetting, hurtful, harassing, and passing it off as media content. There's a real sense, I think, in that particular instance that the values of of the news media are about being sensational, about creating an enemy and about sometimes piling on criticism and sometimes abuse to particular people. And it's no secret that there are power dynamics here that are, I think, much more important to focus on than simply get rid of anonymity.
So defamation, high bar to action. The thing that I did, and I think credit where credit is due, the good thing about this legislation is that it either requires the consent to have your anonymity removed, so you consent for your anonymity to be lifted, or it requires a court order. And I was quite relieved by that. In the first statements that came out by our government, it wasn't clear that was going to be a requirement. So putting aside how often this provision will be used, I was comforted that level of oversight was there, and that is a positive. Emily, do you think this legislation will be used very often, and in comparison to, for example, the e-safety adult bullying provisions, which are much cheaper, much safer, much quicker, go through the e-safety commissioner and hopefully have the offending content taken down within 24 hours? And should note that legislation only comes into action on the 22nd of January this year coming. So it's new legislation. And I think that in contrast to the anti-trolling or anti-defamation action, is actually quite sound, well thought out, well thought through legislation. So Emily, I would be interested in an expert's opinion on that as opposed to my ruminations.
It's a great question, to ask. How many people who are being harassed and abused on social media would like to sue that person? Is that a solution that everyday Australians would like? Because I'm not sure that it is, and I feel like, as we've canvassed already, legal proceeds and defamation lawsuits are costly. They are expensive. I don't think it would occur to a lot of people, even after this legislation, if this legislation passes, I don't think it would occur to most people that this is something that they can access, and this is a good way to stop somebody from being harassed and trolled and bullied and abused online. It's really interesting as well that it seems to be that if you're going to try to sue somebody for defamation, how does that work in the case of, for example, being swarmed or flooded by a whole lot of different people? We saw, I think, especially, a huge example of this was in the Gamergate controversy some years back now, when a huge part of this sort of concerted campaign to make women and non-binary people feel unwelcome in the video games industry and community was that we saw a lot of people, especially marginalised people, just get absolutely flooded with abuse and harassment. It became really difficult for some people to even open their Twitter and wade through hundreds or thousands of notifications to get to somebody who actually wanted to reach them as a person, right? How is suing someone, let's say an individual, going to help with that? Is it so? That's already, I think, a very interesting question. I would also really love to see some stories that come out of the e-safety bill and the e-safety legislation, if indeed they have come up with an easier, more straightforward way to remove things that are said about somebody on social media. Yeah. I'd love to see how that's going to work, and to hear from people who have successfully gone through that process and found that because of it, their social media is a safer and kinder and more useful space for them. Because I think those stories could have the potential to be really valuable and important.
So I think that's absolutely right. And I can see already that the e-safety commissioner is going to be, I guess, an important guest for the podcast. In doing some of the research for this, we did look at the number of complaints that have been made to the e-safety commissioner around children's cyberbullying, which is largely what the complaints are around, and also image-based abuse, which is also something where the provisions have been considerably strengthened, and the e-safety commissioner will have a whole raft of new tools from the 22nd of January. And what I was surprised by was both the effectiveness. So they claim that something like 92% of complaints that they receive, that they're able to action, the offending content is removed within 72 hours. This new legislation changes it to be removal within 24 hours. But also, so yes, it's effective, But the number of complaints, let me take a guess. How many complaints do you think they received? I think this was in a 1920 year period.
Not many?
3,000 was the action. To go to your point, this type of behavior, there'd be 3,000 bad things said online or bullying activities happening almost on an hourly basis, I would expect. And so I was surprised by how few complaints are being made, but very interested to see how that evolves. And I think the work that the eSafety Commissioner, Julia Mann-Grant, is doing is excellent, and she has a great team. But a tough job ahead of them, I think, as they expand their powers and more people rightly become aware of what they offer. Melinda, still, can I throw to either of you before we move on to talk about the inquiry into big tech?
I was just going to say 3,000 complaints. That's only 10 a day out of 20 million internet users in Australia, or 18 million, or whatever we're talking about.
It was shockingly small to me.
Which tells me, to go back to Emily's point, that this is not the way people choose to deal with things. I mean, there may be an education problem. They may not know that this is an avenue.
That was exactly what I was going to say.
But there are tools within the platforms themselves to complain about someone. I mean, if someone was abusive to me on Twitter, I would deal with that on Twitter. I wouldn't involve the government.
And I think one of the things that is also part of this misnomer anti-trolling legislation is a call and in fact a demand that platforms have more efficient complaints mechanisms. And again, I think that is a positive to come out of this legislation if we end up with the platforms providing options for people to actually have complaints and have those complaints actioned, because that is a common concern that people have, that whilst the complaint mechanisms may exist, they're not necessarily particularly effective in all instances.
Johanna, can I just jump in there? And I think maybe we'll get to this later on in our conversation as well, but I'm going to be, put my sort of policy nerd hat on here and say, the thing that I would really like to see in policies and legislation is what is the intended outcome, and you sort of form a view on whether you think that's actually going to deliver it, right? And I think what I'm hearing everyone else saying is my perspective as well. I just don't understand how you would really think that this defamation approach is actually going to get you where you want to get. I think part of the problem that we've got at the moment is that this is the sort of issue around which I think ideally you would get the platforms to sit down and seriously, constructively work with government to work out what the various approaches might be to get the desired outcomes without going the legislative route first and foremost. And then you track the outcomes you're looking for and you see the progress that's being made and you evolve on the way through. That's not the way we're doing policy at the moment, and so it doesn't really lend itself to that kind of responsiveness, if you like. So that's my biggest kind of complaint with these, or concern around these things, is that they get written into law against the backdrop of an industry which is moving really quickly, and I would prefer to see, a more collaborative approach to it. And I say that knowing full well that there is cynicism around big tech and all the rest of it, but I do think that that's going to get you to a better place.
And actually, the approach you've described is not dissimilar to the approach that was followed for the e-safety legislation, which was implemented after extensive consultation. There's these codes which are controversial that are currently being negotiated, but industry is having a big role in designing and inputting them. In many respects, I think this anti-troll legislation is doing a disservice to Minister Fletcher's legacy, because he actually has made some sensible policy progressions. And so it is interesting to see also the difference between the stated public objective, so the rhetoric around the announcement, we want to go after trolls, this behaviour is bad, versus the stated objective in the legislation, which is much, much more narrower and actually has very little, as we've said, to do about trolls. So I think that is a nice segue into the announcement of the inquiry into big tech. It was announced last week. Very important issue, no question about it, that we need to be having a look at the role of large technology companies and impact that they're having on our lives, on children. Many of the points that you had touched upon there, Melinda, but others have also raised. But I have serious questions about the timing of this inquiry. It's to report Conveniently, in February, we are leading up into election season. The election in Australia has to happen before May this year. It's a well-known fact that every election needs to have a crisis. Stilgarian, do you think big tech is the crisis of the 2022 Australian election?
That's an interesting question. I mean, certainly the anti-defamation component of everything we've discussed is part of the government's crisis in having their election messaging disagreed with in, shall we say, robust terms. I mean, Australia used to have a tradition of robust political commentary, I thought, but that seems to be gone by the wayside. What worries me is the speed about it. I mean, certainly, yes, we are the government who can protect you from all the bad things on the internet. We're seeing it hammering this idea of safety, safety, safety. But safety from what? Safety from whom? The trolls, whoever they are. And as we've said, that could be almost anyone, depending on how you want to define the word troll in that sentence. What worries me about the timing, and I don't know whether this is your concern as well, Johanna, is that it does seem to be a bit of a rush, and it is about informing this decision on how the eSafety Commissioner can use her new regulatory tools. I just think it might have been an idea to think about how those tools could be used before she was given them, and in particular look at how they might be misused, because, I mean, the whole structure relies on the eSafety Commissioner being a person acting in good faith. And fine, Julie Inman-Grant may well be such a person, so might her successor. But what about people after that? The process does seem to be backwards and rushed.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because there was a long conversation about what regulatory tools the Safety Commissioner should have. She hasn't yet exercised those tools because they don't come into play until the 22nd of January, which is a couple of weeks, a month at most before the report ends. So it does seem it's either too late or too early to address the particular stated question. Melinda, do you have any thoughts on this?
Oh, where to start? Where to start? Let me start with the practicalities of it. It's December. It's going to report in February. I think, like the rest of Australia, a big bunch of us are having a big chunk of time off. So let's call this a 4-week inquiry. It's just a ridiculous time frame. You know, big tech, I think, is an easy target at the moment with all the whistleblower stuff coming out of the US, the issue around where do they pay tax, just the size of these businesses now. I think, there are some concerns and some issues that probably do really need to be explored. You know from our previous conversations that I'm a big fan of actually transparency and independent assessment of what the implications of what they're doing, of emerging tech, of the structure of businesses, all the rest of it. I'm up for that, but I think a 4-week inquiry doesn't make sense in anyone's book. And it also, I mean, as a policy person, I know I keep saying this, but we actually don't think that the lead up to elections is a really good time to be discussing serious policy. It's not an environment in which you get nuanced conversation. It's an environment where you rule things in and out in very simplistic and blunt ways. So I don't think any of that bodes well in terms of what we get out of it. The only other thing I was just going to do, just as a bit of an economics marker, if you like, is just to say that these conversations around these big businesses are not new. Yes, they have a particular dimension in the context of technology, but you can go back to the early 1900s when we had very serious big antitrust conversations around the big companies of the time, the Standard Oils of the world and all the rest of it. So when you get businesses that lend themselves to scale and potentially anti-competitive behaviour of a whole bunch of different complexions, they do eventually attract the interest of regulators. So I think that's just a kind of a bit of a marker to say, yes, there are aspects of this that are specific to big tech, but big companies themselves get focused on at different points in time for very reasonable consideration, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's true to say that big tech seems to be in the sights of the Morrison government. And I think there are very legitimate reasons to shine a light on big tech. I just don't think you can do that in the timeframe that we have for this inquiry in a meaningful way. And as such, I think it's doing it a disservice. Well, let's move on to favourite topic of many of us, I'm sure, encryption. So encryption, I pressed Minister Fletcher a little on encryption. The context for the conversation with Minister Fletcher is that under the new e-safety laws, there are a series of ministerial discretionary powers where there is draft basic online safety expectation provisions that have been published that say that if communication is encrypted, there is still an expectation that platform providers will apply the e-safety provisions, so that they will ensure that children aren't being bullied on encrypted platforms, or that adults aren't being harassed or having accusations of serious intent to harm. Now, in principle, no one wants children to be bullied online, and no one wants to be harassed or have serious harm threatened against them. But there is a very real question that this raises around encryption. Now, Stilgarian, you on your 9 p.m. Edict podcast have a wonderful thing called the trigger words, where you ask people to send in advance trigger words for your guests. And I feel like if I did that for you, there would be an inundation of the word encryption. So what do you have to say for us here?
Wow. Yes, I have written about this a lot over the last decade or more. And I did write a paper for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington on the whole history of Australia's approach to encryption on the internet, which... okay, this is important stuff. I mean, people often find it abstract, and that's why the government thinks they can gloss over any nuanced discussion of it, because it's to protect us from the unholy trinity of terrorists, international drug dealers and pedophiles. Look at, to kind of explain why it's important, when you go about your business at home, at work, wherever, there's a lock on the door, there's a lock on the filing cabinet, a passcode on your phone. When your information is in transit over the internet or stored somewhere on the internet, encryption is that lock for you on the internet. You have the key to the lock. You can decide what to unlock and show to people and so on. So the argument then becomes, there are valid reasons for you to be forced to unlock stuff. Like, in the same way you can be forced to unlock your house because the cops have a search warrant because they have a reasonable suspicion that something criminal is going on inside. That's not something which anti-encryption people are arguing, at least the ones genuinely arguing the issue. The question then becomes, yeah, but who can demand that? And moreover, with things like the Toller Act and such, there's the idea that other people are allowed to have a copy of the key, or the lock can be not broken, but weakened so that someone with locksmithing skills knows how to open it, even if they don't have a key. So the question from there is, well, hang on, if you've weakened the lock, it doesn't have to be the good guy locksmith who can undo it. The bad guy locksmith could do it too. And under what circumstances, even if the good guy does it, how is that approved? And it's something that tends to be glossed over quite a lot. But who gets to have a key? And that's the question. But we never seem to look at the rights-based aspects of it, our right to privacy, our right to fair communication and so on. It's always about protecting us from the abstract evil.
So I guess the question is, how do we address this challenge in a way that ensures there are rules that can be enforced around who gets the key when they get the key, rather than this simplistic idea of these communications and encryption should be broken. Emily, do you have some thoughts on that?
Again, I feel like it's important to be thinking through, okay, where are people going to turn when encrypted services become a problem with them? And now my research is on social media. So when I think about encryption, I'm thinking very specifically about encrypted chat services, like apps like Telegram, for example. Even Facebook Messenger has introduced levels of encryption. So going back to our earlier discussions around social media harassment and abuse, it's worth asking those questions. Like if someone is having a problem with this stuff, if someone's being harassed, if they're getting unwanted messages, if a conversation that they've been having with someone quickly spirals into something really threatening and menacing and unpleasant, where are they going to turn? What options do they know that they have? So for example, you can still use platforms to block people. You can still delete people. Those mechanisms variously work. Sometimes, blocking somebody is enough to give them the message that you really don't want to hear from them anymore. There are lots of other scenarios in which the block button doesn't do enough. So it's, like Melinda was suggesting earlier, like what is the outcome here? What happens when, what options are available to somebody who's using encrypted chats or encrypted platforms, and can platforms do anything more to help them? And if not, what other powers do we have, including government legislation, to intervene when things are going wrong?
And I guess playing the devil's advocate and the opposite side of the argument that I just made with the basic online safety expectations is that actually what the government is trying to indicate here is that we do have an expectation that even if it is encrypted communications, that you have a complaints mechanisms, for example, which is one of the things that is on the basic online safety expectations.
Yeah, that's right. Encrypted chats don't mean completely unmoderated, free-for-all chats. There are still platform functions built in there that let people have some degree of control about who contacts them and how.
There's 2 points there, really. One is that if it is a group chat on an encrypted platform, that group gets to do its own moderation, right? They don't need the platform to see into their group for them to enforce their own moderation policies. Again, it gets back to what are the policies of that group of people, not of the global internet. But secondly, if I'm in an encrypted chat or even a one-to-one encrypted message and I'm copying abuse or whatever, I'll decrypt the message and show the platform or the authorities. I don't need them to be able to do it. I'm the one making the complaint. I'll do it.
I think that goes to the point about social norms and actually encouraging people that there are things that you can do to respond to this type of behavior, right? That it's not that you don't have to be powerless in the face of it. And parents don't need to be powerless in the face of it with children, which is really what a big part of this legislation and the online safety legislation is focused on. Melinda, from an economic perspective, encryption underpins the banking system. The world would literally grind to a halt if we broke encryption because we wouldn't be able to access our money.
Look, I think as I'm listening to everyone talk, I'm thinking it's really important to distinguish the tool from the intent. So we're talking about a tool to protect who can access information and data. That's what it is. It's a tool, and there should be rules around when you get to use that tool or when the tool can be unlocked. I think that's entirely sensible, but I do think you need to have proper processes and transparency. And all of the usual sorts of governance things that we put around that sort of stuff. From a business perspective, let me sort of put something on the table, which maybe I'm going to go off in a different direction, but I find the fact that all of a sudden you start talking about encryption as if it's something that suggests you're hiding something. Yet if I go, so I'm a company director, right? And for a while there's this little idea floating around that we can be personally liable for cybersecurity, which I find incredibly intimidating, to be honest. And then to have that responsibility potentially sort of touted, but then to also be thinking, well, how are we thinking about encryption? Is this something that's seen as bad? Does it look like we've got something to hide? I just think, again, there's just these sort of mixed messages out there. It's a tool that has good intent in some instances, bad intent in others. Let's put the proper governance arrangements around it. And there should be a high bar for unpicking someone's lock, to use the analogy, as far as I'm concerned. And honestly, if I go and have a look at ASIC's own cyber resilience good practice advice, it says the progressive companies are already using encryption to make sure that the right people have access, and only the right people have access to data for the right reasons. So I think, again, we've got to understand, when are we talking about it? When's the tool being used and for what purpose? And then calibrate the appropriate policies and legislative regulatory responses accordingly. And I am always in favour of making sure you've got lots of checks and balances there, because otherwise I do think to use a terrible pun, we're on a slippery slope.
Well, I do love slippery slides. So let's, I think I would love to talk more about directors' duties, but I feel like that's probably a conversation for another podcast. The basic online safety expectations and encryption, I think there's a lot of conversations to be had there about what they actually mean. And that goes to the tool and the intent question. Are they expecting active monitoring, or are they talking about you need to provide a complaints mechanism? And, this is actually these expectations are currently draft. So it's something that we can all have potentially have the ability to shape, which is actually really important for us all. And one of the things that we want to encourage is that more people are actively focused in these conversations and recognize that actually, do you want better complaints mechanisms from your social media platforms? If you do, get involved in these discussions that are happening right now with respect to the online safety legislation, because this is a mechanism by which you can have more effective social media complaints mechanisms. So it's a bit of a call to action, if you like. One of the other issues that we spoke about in the interview with Minister Fletcher was the News Media Bargaining Code. Now, the efficacy of the Media Bargaining Code is one whole set of questions, which you're welcome to comment on if you like. I think there is a legitimate question about how much of the money that is now being paid to news media is going to journalism. Putting that aside, from a regulatory perspective, what I'm particularly interested in is this asymmetry of power, which Melinda, you referred to at the start. And I asked Minister Fletcher whether or not, knowing what he now knows after the discussions that he's had with senior members from industry, whether he would draft the technical aspects of that legislation differently. And his response was no. And he pushed back quite forcefully when I suggested that there was an information asymmetry. And my lived experience of this is that there really is, that the public service, that government does not necessarily understand the technologies that they're seeking to regulate. Neither in many instances may the public. And so how do we actually address that information asymmetry, or knowledge asymmetry is perhaps a better way to describe it, so that we can have more informed debates, so that we can have a conversation about, do we want complaints platforms or do we want court action? But to do that, you do need to have an understanding of what is technically possible. So we'll start with Melinda, but I can see thoughtful looks on everybody's faces. So we'll go around the table.
I got to throw a cheeky little comment in first, saying, gosh, it's nice to have someone looking after you when you haven't cottoned on to the impact that technology is going to have on your business.
Yeah.
In terms of advertising revenues, but conversation for another day. Johanna, one of the things that we've sort of talked about is actually just trying to get more visibility on our tech aspirations as a nation, the opportunities and the challenges. And we talked about appointing a chief technologist, not because we don't think the chief scientist hasn't got the smarts to do it, but because we actually think it's really important that we've got visibility there. And one of the things that we'd love for that role, or someone to be overseeing, is an independent assessment of emerging technology and technologies that are becoming more prevalent, and what it means for policy and regulation, and the sorts of issues that policymakers and regulators should, as part of the course of their jobs, be considering. And I think that serves two purposes. One, it provides independent advice into the policymakers themselves, but by making it transparent, it should hopefully also raise the expectations of the broader community that government has got answers to very important and legitimate questions, and that they are then explaining how their policy or regulatory responses are actually dealing with the issues that have been raised. And so I think there does need to be a lot more effort put into this, and a lot more effort put into expanding the conversation on these issues and illuminating where issues are emerging that do need either some form of stewardship, or for the community to be aware of the implications for them and their own decisions and behaviours. So that's just one thing that I would put in the mix.
I'm just busy listening to Melinda and her wisdom on this issue. I think, it's interesting to me that all of us have such a small slice of understanding of how, these digital conversations work. You have to start from accepting that your view of the online conversation space is really limited. I think that we really need to broaden our perspectives and really acknowledge that there's just so much going on that we never see. So, more stories about the different ways that people come to these platforms and how they make themselves into an identity on the internet and how they then use that identity to communicate with others. This happens in millions of different ways all across Australia and the world every day. We have a really small perspective of how that really truly looks.
I don't know how you're going to follow that, Stilgarian.
No, neither do I. There's too many thoughts running in my head about this. Part of me, particularly with the news bargaining code, part of me feels like just saying to those large legacy news outlets, yeah, well, you made your mistakes 25 years ago. Stuff you screwed it up. Let's move on. Reap what you sowed or failed to sow back in the 1990s. We stopped propping up automobile manufacturing in Australia when it was clearly uneconomical. So why are we propping up these industrial age media factories when there are so many more nimble, smarter and cost-effective possible ways of doing it? Of course, that doesn't go down well with the politicians who have close associations with those large outlets. And now that I say that, I realise that a lot of their view of trolling online is because they fail to do what Emily is doing and looking at it through multiple perspectives. All they see is them being a politician and people on the other side of politics having a go at them, often with very rude words. And that's not pleasant, but that's exactly how we talk about them when we're in the pub or when we're around the dinner table. They're just seeing it for the first time.
All right. I would love to keep this conversation going, particularly if we could have it at the pub over a beer. But I am going to have to wrap it up. What we'd like to do in closing is to do a loop around the table in terms of what, if you're new to this field, if you're interested in tech policy, but you don't have a background, what resources would you recommend? And perhaps I'll start. One of the best books that I've read on these issues is actually called The Manuables by Lionel Shriver. She's the one who wrote We Need to Talk About Kevin, right? So total mainstream author. It's a novel set in the near future, so 20, 35, 45, I think. And I won't say any more about it than that, but it's a great book. Emily.
Well, I'll give you two non-fiction examples of books that you can turn to learn more about internet policy and tech policy and why it matters. The first one is from an American author, Silicon Values, The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism by Gillian C. York, who is an activist and prominent member of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, has written some just a really great overview of this stuff. And closer to home, a professor of law and the internet at Queensland University of Technology, Nick Souza, has written Lawless, The Secret Rules That Govern Our Digital Lives. It's a really fascinating, refreshingly Australian take on a lot of how policy drives the internet and how it really impacts the way that we use so many of these platforms.
Thanks, Emily. Melinda?
I might just direct your listeners to a couple of websites, which is maybe a slightly different take on it, but one of the things that I think really excites people's interest in policy is when they can see what tech does, which is really good and new and different, if you like. And so I would suggest GovLab in the US at New York University. I think it's govlab.org. The Technology and Public Purpose Project at the Belfer Center at Harvard. Yeah. And also New America in the US as well. They all sort of dive into some of the policy aspects of tech, but also look at how technology can transform the way government works, which is also a little bit of a passion of mine.
Brilliant. We'll put links to all of this in the pod notes, which I think we're doing. I don't really know. I've not done this before. Can you tell? Stilgarian, over to you.
Well, Emily mentioned Electronic Frontiers Foundation in the US. The Australian equivalent is Electronic Frontiers Australia. If you follow them, they look at these issues particularly from a rights-based point of view, your digital rights online and so on. They're a little less full-on libertarian. They're their American cousin. And if you follow them on Twitter, they'll certainly link to any new policy stuff coming out, any interesting articles to read. I should plug the tech mastheads that in Australia do good work on this. ZDNet, who I write for, and our competitors itnews.com.au, both cover the government stuff. ZDNet in more length, and IT News usually quicker off the mark because that's their style. And an American blog/podcast called Lawfare, which is awesome. It's all right, that intersection of law and information and so on. They have an excellent podcast, which is just called the Lawfare Podcast. And there's a sub-series of that called Arbiters of Truth, which is all about those aspects of online moderation and who gets to have a say. They look at it obviously with a bit of an American perspective, but they do look at issues globally. So, they will do an episode on Australia's laws and encryption and so on when that becomes relevant.
And I think one of the co-hosts is Australian, right? Of that.
She is, and yes,
her name escapes me. But we'll put it in the we'll put it in the notes.
I was going to go, yeah, her.
Yeah.
She's great.
She is fabulous. She's really good. And I would
she has
also
a name.
A very great name. I would also say for those who are listening and want to know more about actions that you can take personally, I would also highly recommend the eSafety Commissioner's website. There's great provisions and resources there for young people, for women, for older people. It really is a fabulous and underutilized resource, which I would recommend to everybody. Melinda, Emily, Stilgarian, thank you so much for bearing with me through this first episode. Listeners, if you're still here, thank you for listening. We do really want to hear from you about what you want to hear on future podcasts, so please get in touch, techpolicydesign@anu.edu.au, and we'll be back in the new year with the next podcast. Thank you very much. Talking Tech Policy is a podcast of the ANU Tech Policy Design Centre. This episode was produced by Anna Davies. Tanvi, Nair and Amy Denmede provided invaluable research support. Ben Gowdie provided support that only an avid podcast listener can provide. Thank you, our listeners, for listening, and please do leave us a review.